I still remember that night as if it happened only yesterday. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your chest and makes you notice every tick of the clock. I had just slipped into bed, grateful for a moment of rest, when a sharp knock rattled my front door. It wasn't gentle, not the kind of knock you expect from a neighbor or a friend. It was hurried, desperate, like someone trying to rid themselves of a burden. I pulled my robe around me and shuffled toward the door, my heart beating faster with each step. When I opened it, the cold air rushed in, cutting straight through me. But the chill in the wind wasn't what froze me in place. There, on my doorstep, was a small bundle wrapped in a hospital blanket. A baby. His tiny face scrunched, his cries piercing the quiet night, echoing across the empty street. For a moment, I couldn't move. My hands shook as I bent down, and that's when I saw the note. Folded and pinned to the blanket, my daughter-in-law's handwriting rushed in careless. It said only 6 words. "He's yours now. Don't call me." I scanned the darkness, searching for her car, her figure, anything that explained this nightmare. But the street was empty. She was gone. I scooped the baby into my arms, his small body trembling as I pressed him against my chest. I should have felt only pity for that innocent child. But a storm of emotions crashed inside me, rage, grief, and something I could barely put into words. My own son's wife had abandoned her newborn at my door, and with that, she had abandoned me too. Inside the house, I sat on the couch, rocking the baby back and forth. His cries quieted, but my mind wouldn't rest. I thought of my son. Surely he couldn't know about this. Surely he would come looking. But when I reached him the next morning, his words cut deeper than any knife. He said, "He's your burden now, not mine." And in that single moment I realized the truth. I was no longer just a grandmother. I was the only mother this child would ever really know. But what I didn't realize then was how that night would set off years of heartbreak, betrayal, and battles I never asked for. And when the time came, when I found myself staring at my son across a courtroom, it wasn't anger that carried me through. It was a secret I had kept locked away in a sealed folder. A secret that would make the judge freeze in disbelief and silence the entire room. If you're watching this video, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story has reached. Don't just listen quietly, support this community so we can keep sharing stories like this one. Long before that night when the baby was left on my doorstep, the cracks in our family had already begun to show. I had always believed I had raised my son, Daniel, to understand responsibility, to value love, and to honor the bonds that tie a family together. But somewhere along the way, the boy I raised drifted into a life that I could barely recognize. He was smart, ambitious, and charismatic, but he was also reckless. And when he met Jessica, I felt a knot in my stomach the very first day she walked into my home. She was striking, the kind of woman who knew the power she carried when she entered a room. But beneath the surface I saw something else. She carried herself like someone always seeking attention, always searching for an escape, never willing to stay grounded in reality. She smiled, yes, but it never quite reached her eyes. And when she spoke, her words often circled back to herself. Her needs, her frustrations, her endless complaints. I wanted to believe she would grow out of it, that time would soften her edges. But as their relationship deepened, the patterns only grew worse. She was careless with money, selfish with her time, and easily irritated by anything that didn't fit her vision of freedom. When Jessica became pregnant, instead of the joy and excitement most women feel, she wore it like a burden chained to her ankle. She complained about her swollen feet, about the weight she gained, about the way people looked at her. But never once did I hear her speak of the baby with warmth. Never once did she wonder aloud if the child would have Daniel's smile or my husband's eyes. I remember one afternoon, as she sat at the kitchen table, flipping through magazines while I prepared lunch. She sighed loudly and said, "This wasn't supposed to happen. I had plans. I'm too young to be stuck with a baby." Her words pierced me like shards of glass. I tried to offer her encouragement, to remind her that motherhood was not a trap but a gift. She rolled her eyes and muttered, "Easy for you to say. You already lived your life. Mine's just starting." Daniel, instead of correcting her, instead of standing tall as the man I had hoped he'd become, just laughed nervously and brushed it aside. He always did. Whenever Jessica's selfishness showed, he excused it, defended her, or shifted the blame onto someone else. Too often, that someone was me. I told myself not to interfere too much, that young marriages often stumbled before they found their balance. But deep down I knew Jessica didn't want balance. She wanted freedom, and she was going to take it no matter what it cost the rest of us. The baby was born on a rainy night, and though I had prepared myself for the worst, nothing could have prepared me for the way Jessica looked at him. Most mothers cry tears of joy when they hold their child for the first time. Jessica looked down at her newborn as though he were a stranger who had intruded on her life. Her lips pressed tight, her eyes glazed, her body stiff. Daniel kissed her forehead, beaming with pride, while I stood by, my heart already breaking for the little boy who deserved so much more warmth than he was receiving. We named him Ethan. Least I did. Jessica barely cared what he was called. Daniel shrugged, said the name was fine, and signed the birth certificate. And from that day forward, it was as if Ethan was placed in my arms permanently. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights, endless bottles, and soft lullabies whispered into the darkness. But they were my lullabies, not Jessica's. She refused to wake when Ethan cried. She claimed exhaustion, she claimed stress, but even in the daylight she showed little interest. She would leave the baby with me to go shopping, to visit friends, to take long drives alone. Daniel, instead of stepping in, would pat my shoulder and say, "Mom, you're better at this than she is. Just help us out for now." For now stretched into weeks. Weeks into months, and soon it was as if I were Ethan's mother in every way except name. I didn't mind caring for him. I loved him deeply from the moment I held him, but I resented the way my son and his wife treated him as though he were nothing more than an inconvenience. One night the tension broke wide open. I had just put Ethan to sleep when I heard arguing in the next room. Jessica's voice was sharp, laced with fury. Daniel's tone was low, tired. I didn't want to eavesdrop, but their words carried through the thin walls. Jessica shouted, "I can't do this anymore, Daniel. I never asked for this. You and your mother can raise him, because I'm done." My knees weakened as I leaned against the wall, the weight of her words crushing me. And then I heard the sound of a suitcase zipper, the thud of drawers being emptied. I rushed into the room just as she slung her purse over her shoulder, her suitcase dragging behind her. "Jessica," I pleaded, "don't do this. He's your son. He needs you." She glared at me with eyes that carried no warmth, no regret. "No. He's your problem now. You wanted him more than I ever did. You take him. I'm leaving." Daniel stood frozen, his lips parted but no words coming out. His silence was worse than her cruelty. He didn't chase her. He didn't stop her. He didn't fight for his child. He just stood there as the front door slammed shut, leaving me in the middle of a storm I never asked for. That was the night everything changed. I held Ethan close as Jessica's car disappeared down the street. His tiny breaths pressed against my neck as tears rolled down my cheeks. I wanted to scream at Daniel, to demand answers, to force him to take responsibility. But when I looked into his eyes, all I saw was defeat. He whispered, "Mom, I can't do this. He's your burden now." The words lodged in my chest like broken glass. My son, the boy I raised, the man I believed in, handed his child over to me as though he were a chore to be delegated, a task to be checked off. I should have been furious, and I was. But as I stared down at Ethan, innocent and helpless, I knew I couldn't let anger consume me. I had a choice that night, to let bitterness destroy us both, or to pour every ounce of love I had into that little boy and protect him from the storm his parents created. I chose love. I chose to be more than a grandmother. I chose to be the mother he deserved. And yet, as I rocked him to sleep in the quiet hours of that night, I felt a heaviness in my heart I couldn't shake. A heaviness that whispered this was only the beginning. What I didn't know then was that raising Ethan would turn me into both his protector and the target of my own child's betrayal. The days after Jessica walked out and Daniel placed Ethan in my arms stretched into weeks, and those weeks became years. What began as an unthinkable burden slowly transformed into my greatest purpose. Raising Ethan wasn't easy. It was exhausting, frightening, and sometimes unbearably lonely, but it was also the only thing that gave my life meaning in those years when everything else seemed to crumble around me. In those early days, sleep became a stranger. Ethan would wake every 2 or 3 hours, his cries slicing through the night like alarms I could never silence. I would stumble out of bed, my body heavy with fatigue, my eyes burning with exhaustion. But the moment I picked him up and pressed him against my chest, the world felt still again. His tiny fists would grip my nightgown, his little face would bury into the crook of my neck, and I would remind myself that no matter how tired I was, this child deserved love, safety, and warmth. There were mornings when I would rock him by the window just to watch the sun rise, whispering promises into his ears that he couldn't yet understand. I promised him that I would never leave, that I would never treat him like a mistake, that I would fight for him even if it meant standing against my own blood. When Ethan spoke his first word, it wasn't mama or daddy, it was Nana. That was what he called me from the moment he could form sounds. His voice was small and unsteady, but when he said it, my heart melted into pieces I didn't know could be broken any further. In his mind, I wasn't just the grandmother who held him when he cried. I was the center of his world. He took his first steps in the hallway of my house, his chubby legs wobbling, his hands reaching for me as I crouched down with tears streaming down my face. I clapped and cheered as he stumbled into my arms, his giggle filling the house with a joy that had been missing for so long. Those milestones, his first steps, his first words, his first day of preschool, became the pillars of my life. They reminded me why I endured the long nights, the empty bank account, and the constant ache in my back from carrying both him and the weight of a responsibility that was never supposed to be mine. But while Ethan was my pride and joy, not everyone saw him that way. In town, people whispered. They knew Jessica had left. They knew Daniel had all but disappeared. Some would lower their voices when I walked into the grocery store, muttering words they thought I couldn't hear. That's the baby she's raising alone, the one his mother didn't want. Others would glance at me with pity, offering forced smiles that stung almost as much as the gossip. I held my head high in public, but at night, when Ethan was asleep, those whispers rang in my ears. I felt judged, looked down upon, as if I had done something wrong by stepping in when no one else would. But no matter how much shame or gossip surrounded us, it all disappeared when Ethan's little arms wrapped around my neck. The financial strain was relentless. Raising a child alone isn't easy, not for anyone, and especially not for a grandmother who thought her child-rearing years were behind her. I picked up extra shifts at work, stretched every dollar until it tore, and often went without so that Ethan could have what he needed. Some nights, dinner for me was little more than toast and tea, while Ethan enjoyed a plate of food I carefully prepared to keep him strong. I wore old shoes with soles worn thin, while I saved up to buy him new ones each time he outgrew his. Daniel visited occasionally, though I hesitate even to call it that. His appearances were rare, short, and always clouded with bitterness. He would come through the door, glance at Ethan as though he were looking at a stranger, and sit at the table complaining about his life. He never brought gifts, never asked about Ethan's progress, never even tried to play with him. When I asked why, he shrugged and muttered, "I didn't ask for him. He's her mistake, not mine." Those words carved wounds so deep into me that I feared they might never heal. How could my own son look at his flesh and blood and feel nothing but disdain? How could he reduce an innocent child to nothing more than an unwanted consequence? I tried to shield Ethan from those words, but children are perceptive. They know when they are being rejected, even if no one says it aloud. And while Ethan never cried in front of Daniel, I saw the confusion in his eyes. I saw the way he pulled closer to me, as if seeking refuge from a man who should have been his protector. Ethan's love for me only deepened as the years went on. He clung to my hand when we crossed the street. He ran into my arms at the school gate. He slipped into my bed at night when thunderstorms rattled the windows. His teachers began to call me Mom by mistake, and though I corrected them, a part of me knew that's what I had become. In every way that mattered, I was his mother. Still, children grow, and with growth comes questions. Questions I dreaded, questions I knew were coming. Questions that no lullaby or bedtime story could shield us from forever. It happened one evening when Ethan was 6 years old. We had just finished dinner, and he was coloring at the table while I washed the dishes. His voice was small, but it carried through the room with the force of a storm. He set his crayon down, looked at me with eyes far too wise for his age and asked, "Grandma, why doesn't Daddy want me?" The plate slipped in my hand, clattering against the sink, though it didn't break. My chest tightened, my breath caught, and for the first time in years I had no words. When Daniel returned, it was as if a ghost had walked back into my life. Years had passed since I had last seen him. Years of scraped knees, school recitals, birthdays with one empty chair that Ethan pretended not to notice. I had almost convinced myself he would never come back. And yet there he stood one Saturday afternoon, dressed in a crisp shirt, his arm around a woman who looked polished and deliberate. Her name was Melissa. She smiled too quickly, spoke too sweetly, as though she was trying to sell me something I hadn't asked to buy. Daniel introduced her as his wife. My heart sank, not from jealousy or bitterness, but from an instinct that whispered, "This woman wants something." Melissa leaned down to Ethan, who was then 11, and called him handsome. She said she had heard all about him. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, but forced a polite smile. I saw the confusion in his eyes, the same confusion I felt. In the days that followed, Daniel and Melissa became frequent visitors. At first, it seemed harmless. They brought Ethan toys, took him to the park, even showed up to a school soccer game. The teachers were delighted. It's so good his parents are finally showing up. They didn't understand that Daniel wasn't stepping back into fatherhood out of love. He was circling, testing the ground like a predator watching prey. Melissa was different from Jessica. Where Jessica had been careless and wild, Melissa was strategic. She couldn't have children of her own. I learned this through whispers in the neighborhood. And suddenly, Ethan was no longer just my grandson. He was their golden opportunity, their ready-made family. It started subtly. Daniel would lean close to Ethan when he thought I wasn't watching and say things like, "One day, you'll understand who your real parents are." Or he would casually mention that Ethan deserved a proper home with younger parents who could give him everything. Ethan never repeated these words to me, but I saw the confusion etch deeper into his young face. He began to ask questions, quiet ones. "Grandma, why did Daddy leave before? Why is he here now?" I had to answer carefully, balancing the truth with protection. Then came the shift. One evening, an envelope slid through my mail slot. Inside was a letter from a lawyer. Daniel and Melissa were filing for custody of Ethan. My hands trembled as I read the words, "Unfit guardian, advanced age, best interest of the child." They painted me as a tired, incapable woman clinging to a boy who didn't belong to me. I felt the air leave my lungs. All the sleepless nights, the scraped knees I had bandaged, the meals I had sacrificed to put food on his plate, it was as if none of it mattered. To them, I was just a placeholder, someone to keep Ethan alive until they were ready to collect him. I tried to reason with Daniel. I invited him over, hoping for one honest conversation. But he came with Melissa at his side, and every word that left his mouth sounded rehearsed. "Mom, you've done enough. You've raised him this far, and I'll give you credit for that. But it's time he lives with us. It's what's best for him." Melissa sat stiffly beside him, her hands folded, her smile tight. She didn't speak much, but every time Ethan walked into the room, her eyes lit up with a hunger I couldn't ignore. She wanted him, not because of love, but because he was the missing piece to her picture-perfect life. The weeks that followed were war. Papers from lawyers, whispers in the community, even subtle comments from church friends. Maybe it would be good for Ethan to be with his father now. The world seemed to tilt against me. But Ethan clung to me tighter than ever. At night, he would crawl into my bed and whisper, "Grandma, don't let them take me. Please." His voice was small, but it carried the weight of every fear I had buried deep inside. I began to feel the cracks in my armor. There were nights I sat at the kitchen table, staring at bills and court letters, wondering if maybe they were right, if maybe I wasn't enough anymore. The thought of losing Ethan hollowed me out, and for the first time in years, I almost gave up. But then in one moment of clarity, I remembered. Tucked away in my drawer, behind old photographs and documents, was a sealed folder. A folder I had kept since the night Jessica disappeared. The contents of that folder were the truth. The kind of truth that could turn everything upside down. As I sat there with Ethan asleep in the next room, I ran my hand over that folder, feeling its weight, its promise. And I knew. The fight was not over. My son thought he could rewrite history, but he had forgotten that I had been keeping records, keeping secrets. Secrets that would shatter him. And when the time came, I would not hesitate. Because if he wanted war, he was about to learn that I was stronger than he ever imagined. I whispered into the quiet of my kitchen. I almost gave up then, until I remembered the sealed folder locked in my drawer. The one I had kept for this very moment. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, a place where lives were weighed in silence and judged in seconds. I sat at the long table, my hands trembling beneath the surface, trying to mask the storm inside me. On the opposite side, Daniel sat upright, his tie perfectly knotted, Melissa at his side in a carefully chosen navy dress that made her look both respectable and maternal. They looked like a picture of stability, the kind of couple judges like to see. When the proceedings began, Daniel's lawyer wasted no time. He painted a story where Daniel was the responsible father returning for his son, a man who had turned his life around, who was married, stable, financially secure, and ready to provide Ethan with opportunities one could never afford. Every sentence was polished, rehearsed, dripping with just enough sincerity to make strangers believe him. And then Daniel spoke. His voice was calm, almost sorrowful, as if he were carrying a heavy burden. "Your Honor, I don't blame my mother for how things unfolded. She did what she thought was best. But she's kept my son from me, alienated him, made me out to be a stranger in his own life. I want to fix that. I want to give Ethan the life he deserves." The words sliced through me like knives. Alienated? I had stayed up through fevers, read bedtime stories until my throat burned, skipped meals to make sure Ethan never went hungry. I had been the one to show up to every parent-teacher conference, every scraped knee, every night of fear. And here was my son, the child I once carried in my own arms, standing in front of strangers and discarding all of it like it had never happened. I wanted to stand up, to shout the truth. But I sat still, my hands folded tightly in my lap, because I knew my turn would come. The judge listened intently, his eyes flicking back and forth between us. When Melissa spoke, she did so softly, almost tearfully. "We just want to give him a family, Your Honor. A proper home with both a mother and a father. We want to love him as our own." Her words were calculated, designed to sway sympathy. To anyone who didn't know her, she sounded like a saint. Ethan sat near me, his hands fidgeting in his lap. He was old enough now to understand what was happening, but too young to carry the weight of it. When Daniel glanced his way, Ethan looked down at the floor. He wouldn't meet his father's eyes, but he didn't look at me either. He was trapped between two worlds, and I could see the confusion pressing heavily on his young shoulders. The lawyer's voice droned on about my limitations. My age, my finances, the whispers of neighbors who claimed I was too protective. They spoke as though raising Ethan had been an act of selfishness, not survival. Every word was meant to diminish me, to erase the years of love I had poured into that boy. The judge's expression was hard to read, but I saw his pen tapping against the desk as he scribbled notes, and with each nod, each glance at Daniel, I felt the scales tipping against me. My chest tightened, and for the first time, I felt the true weight of defeat pressing down. I lowered my eyes to the table, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. Was this how it would end? After everything, after sleepless nights and sacrifices no one ever saw, was I going to lose Ethan to the very man who had abandoned him? I closed my eyes, and for a moment I was back at that cold night years ago, standing at the door with a crying newborn in my arms, Jessica's note crumpled in my hand. I remembered the resolve I had made in that moment, to protect him, no matter what. And then, as though fate itself had reached across time, I remembered the folder. The one I had guarded all these years. The one with the truth that Daniel had hoped would never see daylight. I opened my eyes, my breath steadying. The judge had just finished listening to Daniel's final plea, and the room was heavy with silence. It was my turn. I reached down into my bag and pulled out the sealed folder. Its edges were worn from years of being hidden, but its contents were untouched, waiting for this very moment. I placed it gently on the table in front of me. The sound of paper sliding against wood echoed louder than I expected. The courtroom stilled. Daniel's confident expression faltered, just slightly. Melissa shifted in her chair, her hands tightening on her lap. I looked at the judge, my voice steady despite the tears pressing at the corners of my eyes. And then, I whispered. It was my turn. I slid the sealed folder across the table, and the courtroom froze. I slid the folder across the table, and the judge's gaze sharpened. He reached for it slowly, as though the weight of its presence was already pressing on him. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Daniel shifted in his seat, a flicker of unease crossing his face. For the first time that day, I saw fear in his eyes. The judge opened the folder. His brow furrowed as he flipped through the first few pages. The sound of paper turning filled the air, louder than any argument that had been made in that courtroom. Inside were the hospital records, stamped and signed by the attending physician, confirming that Ethan had been discharged directly into my care. Not just handed over, not borrowed, not babysat. He had been formally released to me as his legal guardian that very night. The next document was more damning. A set of abandonment papers, with Jessica's signature scrawled across the bottom, dated the night she left. In her own handwriting, she had declared she wanted no responsibility, no rights, no ties to the baby she carried. Her words were harsh, cold. I can't be a mother. I won't be a mother. I leave him with his grandmother. He will never be my child. The courtroom shifted uneasily. I heard muffled gasps, saw heads turning, eyes widening. Melissa leaned forward, confusion etched on her face. But the judge wasn't finished. He kept reading, his lips tightening as he reached the next set of papers. Financial records, bank statements and notarized transfers. They proved that Daniel himself had signed away financial obligations for Ethan, documents that made it clear he had abandoned his son, not out of ignorance but by choice. His signature was right there in black ink next to mine. He had walked away willingly, leaving me with not just the responsibility, but the proof of his betrayal. The final page was a letter Jessica had written. I had kept it all these years, folded carefully behind the legal documents. In it, she admitted neglect, confessed to nights of leaving Ethan alone in his crib while she went out, to wishing she could escape the life she had chosen. Her words were raw and unfiltered. I'm leaving tonight. Don't try to find me. I was never meant to be a mother. The judge set the papers down slowly, his hand lingering on the letter. The silence that followed was crushing. Daniel's attorney stammered, trying to piece together some rebuttal, but no words came. Melissa's face flushed red. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. You lied to me, she hissed, her voice breaking. You told me she forced you out. You told me you wanted him. Her hands trembled as she gathered her purse, her heels clicking angrily against the courtroom floor as she stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Daniel's mask crumbled. Gone was the polished image of a father fighting for his son. What remained was the boy I had once known, selfish, weak, hiding behind excuses. His shoulders sagged as he buried his face in his hands. The judge leaned back in his chair, visibly shaken. His pen, which had moved so confidently before, now rested motionless on the desk. He glanced at me, then at Ethan, then back at the papers again. His voice was low but firm when he finally spoke. Mr. Harris, these documents speak for themselves. This court cannot ignore the evidence of your willful abandonment. The words hung heavy in the air. Relief washed over me, but it was not triumph I felt. It was sorrow that it had come to this, sorrow that my own son's lies had to be torn apart in public to protect the boy he once left behind. Daniel looked at me then, his eyes bloodshot, his lips pressed together as though he wanted to speak but couldn't form the words. I held his gaze, not with anger, but with the quiet strength of a woman who had endured too much to break now. And as the judge prepared to rule, I thought to myself, the biggest victory wasn't in his hands. It was in Ethan's. The judge's gavel struck once, the sound echoing like a final heartbeat in that courtroom. His voice was steady, deliberate, carrying no trace of doubt. Custody will remain with Mrs. Harris permanently. The evidence presented today makes it clear that Mr. Harris not only neglected his responsibilities, but willingly abandoned his child. This court finds no grounds to disrupt the stable home Ethan has known. The words wrapped around me like a shield. I had braced myself for a fight, for the possibility of loss, but instead I felt a wave of release. Years of sacrifice, of holding on when everything around me threatened to crumble, had not been in vain. Daniel sat motionless, his face pale. His attorney whispered frantically, but the damage was done. The judge's ruling was final. And with the documents now part of the official record, Daniel's past forgery was no longer a private shame. It was a matter of public consequence. I knew the fallout would stretch far beyond that courtroom. Financial penalties, legal investigations, doors closing where he once thought opportunity waited. He had buried his own future with the same lies he tried to bury me under. Melissa never returned. Her absence hung in the air like a second verdict. Whatever story Daniel had fed her had collapsed, leaving nothing but the truth he had tried so hard to hide. He had lost his wife, his credibility, and now, the son he had once cast aside. Ethan sat quietly beside me, his small hand slipping into mine. The courtroom blurred around me as I looked into his eyes. There was no hesitation, no doubt. He wasn't waiting for the judge's words or Daniel's apologies. His choice had already been made. I wasn't just his grandmother. I was the only mother he had ever known. And in that moment he affirmed it without a single word, just a squeeze of my hand, warm and certain. I had not raised my voice. I had not cursed my son, or begged the court for mercy. My revenge had been silent, patient, woven into the very truth Daniel thought he could bury. I simply unwrapped it in the light of day, and let it speak louder than I ever could. As the courtroom emptied, I remained seated for a moment longer, Ethan leaning against my arm. There was no victory dance, no sense of conquest. Only the quiet weight of knowing I had protected him, and the bitter ache of knowing I had lost my son long before the gavel fell. Daniel had chosen selfishness, and in doing so, he had chosen to lose me. But Ethan was different. He chose me. He chose love, safety, the bond we had built from sleepless nights and shared laughter, from scraped knees and whispered prayers. That was all the victory I needed. When I finally rose, I carried the folder with me, not as a weapon anymore, but as a reminder. A reminder that truth, even when hidden, has a way of finding its voice. And as I walked out of that courthouse into the sunlight, I whispered to myself, in the end, I didn't win by fighting harder. I won by refusing to let lies bury the truth. That was my silent revenge. If you stayed with me until now, don't just scroll away. Give this video a like, subscribe, and share it. And please tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story has traveled, and how many hearts it has touched.